A lot of the moral language itself, when we use words like morally good, morally bad, morally right, morally wrong, putting morally perhaps in brackets on each of those occasions, there's a strong tendency for the language itself to assume that kind of absoluteness or objectivity that I've been aiming against. And if you go along with the sort of analysis I've been giving you, you may come to feel that that kind of language is itself rather naive and misleading, and you may come to feel you'd rather avoid it. I suspect that we already largely avoid it, actually. If I see some horrific act portrayed on the TV screen in front of me in the news, if someone's done something that's hurt others or been inconsiderate, and I'm sitting there with my friends, it's most unlikely that I will respond by saying that was a morally wrong act. Now maybe it was, by some reasonable standard, but it's most unlikely that I'll say that. I don't very often hear people talk like that except in philosophy books. I'm much more likely to say something like, what an asshole, or what a shitty thing to do. I'm likely to use language like that, which expresses my emotions, which invites similar emotions from others, invites similar value judgments from others, but does not purport, in any way to say, this is supported by God or the universe or the order of reality or some objective order of values or something else. I don't use that kind of highfalutin language. I use a mixture of thick moral language. I say what a cruel thing to do, and more emotive language. Words like cruel, kind, loyal, and those words are what we call thick moral language. If I say that an actor is a cruel actor or a person is a cruel person, I'm thinking of the suffering that's being inflicted here. A cruel person is presumably a person who inflicts suffering on others and doesn't care or actually enjoys it. There's an actual meaning there, as well as when I say someone's a cruel person, rather than just saying they're stern, for example, I'm also expressing my disapproval, right? The thick moral language partly expresses disapproval, but partly has a perfectly naturalistic meaning. A cruel person is a person who takes pleasure, or at least doesn't care, about inflicting pain on others. I think in practice we tend more to use that sort of thick moral language in our actual day-to-day interaction than we use the thin moral language, saying that act was morally wrong, or that act was morally right, or that act was morally good, or that act was morally bad. And I think there's a reasonable pressure to use that thick moral language because it has a factual, clear, objective meaning. Someone either enjoys inflicting pain on others or they don't. That is objective. But it can combine something that really is objective with an attitude taken towards it. We get by in a pretty fluent, easy sort of way using that kind of language most of the time. But we can trick ourselves if we move away from that language and too quickly start using words like morally right and morally wrong, which that's often naive language. Even good or bad can often be naive language. We looked at simple cases like the hammer and the knife. But what if you're talking about a book? Is this a good book or a bad book? You say you should become a top 50 voice of disbelief by our atheists, or you have to pick up the latest book by Richard Dawkins or a new novel that someone's recommended. There can be a great deal of rational disagreement about what's a good or a bad book because different people want different things from books. And that's perfectly okay, we are being similar to each other, that there'll be some similarity to what we want from books. We don't want it written in some sort of language that we don't understand, but we all want different things, and that can be perfectly okay. We then make our judgments, they can be perfectly rational, non-arbitrary judgments against what it is that we want. And because there's enough commonality between us, we can discuss it in a rational, non-arbitrary way. But once we start moving out to making global judgments about people being good or bad, that's going to be very difficult. There will be few cases where a rational discussion leads all of us to the same conclusion discussion is probably going to lead us all to the same conclusion about the hammer. Maybe we could all agree about Hitler. But, you know, even Hitler has his fans, continues to attract fans. Often it will sound and be very naive to apply that sort of simple, sweeping language of good or bad to people or to actions. It's often better to say something a bit thickened up, like, that's a cruel person, or that's a kind person, or that was a cruel act, or that was a kind act, or this person's, you know, a loyal friend. So I think that already we tend to avoid some of that naive-sounding, thin language. The more we see what the problems with it are, I think the more we will tend to actually avoid it. And I also think when we're doing, you know, formal moral philosophy or very formal discussion of the rights and wrongs of action, we will start to talk about it in a different way if we understand that values are neither strictly objective nor just arbitrary. We will try to find common ground in what values we do have. You know, we'll try to find out what the other person values. We will appeal to those values having found out what they were. We may ultimately have to disagree in some cases because even after full rational reflection ourselves and full rational discussion with the other person, we may find that just right down at the very bottom we disagree. But our approach will be to try to seek that sort of agreement, to try to identify what our values really are at the deepest level, our own as individuals, and to try to see how much common ground we have with others, rather than browbeating the other person, you know, insisting that, you know, God is kind of on our side, or the universe is kind of on our side, or we are just correct in thinking that a particular kind of person is bad or a particular kind of act is bad. It becomes a much more sophisticated exercise engaging in moral discourse. I think once we really understand how values and morality work, how they can be not strictly objective and yet be perfectly rational, reasonable and non-arbitrary. Now I think that's enough of the thesis really. I think I'm going to end there. I know you'll have a lot of questions about it. The point is we can look at this kind of ambiguity. If you think of it as an ambiguity, values and morals don't have to be objective in the strict sense. They appeal ultimately to our needs, our wants, our purposes, and those are of subjects, of beings with subjectivity. There's nothing deeper than that. But we're perfectly capable of handling that and living in a world like